Hello, everyone. My name is John Neville. I'm a senior academic mentor with ESM Prep. And today we are here to talk about how to conquer the SAT reading section. So the reading section is consistently the most difficult section for students to raise their scores. And part of that is understandable in that how quickly you read, how efficiently you read, how focused you are some of the main factors in determining how you do on the SAT reading section. But a lot of that is based off of some misunderstanding, the belief that those are the only factors, um, as well as just that the curricula, the SAT curricula out in the marketplace tends to focus more on the grammar, so the writing and language section, as well as the math, just because those sections of the SAT tend to be more concrete in the principles that they cover and how to help students understand them. So the point of this webinar is to help you realize that you can be just as systematic and methodical in your approach to improving on the SAT reading section as you can be in the other three sections of the SAT. So I'm going to start with a basic overview of the SAT reading section. It starts with, first of all, it's 52 questions in 65 minutes. So this is, what is that, about a minute and 15 seconds per question. And that is a lot more time than the ACT reading section. So the biggest difference between the SAT reading section and the ACT is that the ACT is more of a sprint. The passages for both tests are of similar length. They're both around 750 words, maybe a little bit less. The number of questions in an ACT reading passage is 10, while it's 10 to 11 for the SAT reading passage. So they're pretty comparable in length and in terms of the number of questions. But for the SAT reading section, you get 13 minutes per passage, while for the ACT, you get 8 minutes and 45 seconds. So the ACT is more of a sprint, and the SAT is more of a jog, if you will. Let me share my screen here. One caveat to that is that the ACT is much more likely to ask you questions where the right answer is in the exact same wording, like the way that it was in the passage. While oftentimes for the SAT reading section, the right answer takes what the passage says and then finds a way to reword it to the point where you may not see any familiar words in the correct answer to an SAT reading question. So those are just a couple of differences between the two. And yes, while you can become a faster reader, and hopefully you do become a faster reader in the process of preparing for the SAT or the ACT, how quickly you read and how fast you read can be a big reason why the SAT might be better for you than the ACT. So the reading section is very kind of central to the right choice for you in choosing the SAT or the ACT, in addition to obviously other factors as well. But in general, the ACT reading questions are more straightforward. The SATs tend to be a little bit trickier, and you're often flipping back to the passage much more frequently for the SAT. So as you can see, it's 13 minutes per passage. Right here under clock strategy, I talk about how you want to read the passage in about 5 minutes. A lot of students will read it in maybe 4. Some students will read it in maybe 6, but you don't really want to take more than, I would say, 5 to 6 minutes. Usually 5 is kind of a good average, if not maybe a little bit less. And then that gives you more time to answer the questions. So you're going to be spending, in general, more time answering the questions than you are reading the passage. Another reason why this is the case is because you don't need to memorize every word of the passage. The most important thing is to get a main idea of what happens, as well as to know where things are so that you can go back and look. So for example, if it was a passage about a child's, or about an adult's childhood, knowing, okay, in the second paragraph, they talk about, high school. In the last paragraph, they talk about his relationship with his family, right? So just kind of knowing where things are so that when they ask you a question about his childhood or about high school, rather, to go back to that second paragraph. In terms of passage types, the first passage is always going to be a literary narrative, or also known as fiction. So the first passage is going to be a story. These tend to be the easiest for students to read because they read like a book, and a pretty interesting book, and one that doesn't have too many tough words like some of the other passages as well. Which reminds me, one of the big challenges is that the SAT purposefully includes plenty of words that most high schoolers will not know the meaning of. And this is not something to stress out about. This is something to be expected. At this point, I don't really have or ask my students to study vocabulary to prepare for the SAT. It's not a bad idea as long as the student kind of enjoys and wants to study vocabulary in general, but there's no real need to study definitions and create note cards of words. That was kind of more in the old days, 20 years ago, when there were analogies and vocab on the SAT, which there are not anymore. So instead, it's just best to just get accustomed to the fact that you're going to see a lot of words on the SAT reading passage that you don't know the answer to or the meaning of, but to expect to use context clues to make sense of some of those longer, tougher words. But back to the passage types. The easy way to remember it, as you can see I say here, is that there is one fiction passage, two science passages, and two history passages in general. So there's a social science, which is oftentimes kind of study-based or sociology-based. There is, in general, a natural science passage. Most of my students, I myself, have found the natural science passages to be one of the top two most difficult passages because they tend to go in depth. They tend to include a lot of unfamiliar terms, technical terms. There's stuff about like outer space that has a lot of terms, weird terms, scientific studies. And then there are, there is a US history passage, and then there is, in general, a world history passage. So commonly, the two most difficult passages are, as I said, the natural science passage, but also a historical passage that was written in the year 1785 or the 1800s. And the SAT is not afraid of using a passage or a speech or an article from a time where a lot of the words had different definitions than they might do now. So for example, the word want used to mean lack, like she did not want for a big house, meaning she did not lack a big house, she had a big house. Versus nowadays, the word want means desire, right? Like I want to go to the grocery store. So that's just one example of how you're going to see a passage probably from 200-300 years ago where the words are going to be kind of unfamiliar, or they're going to mean different things, and that's going to make it challenging, and just to expect that. One fact that brings my students a lot of comfort is that a lot of times the most difficult passages have the easiest questions. It's not always true, but the SAT is good about including kind of easier softball questions in some of these difficult passages to just, make sure that, students aren't getting overwhelmed with the difficulty of the material. Speaking of difficulty of the material, a lot of my students stress out about, what if I get a really tough reading passage? And I say, well, if it's going to be tough for you, then it's going to be tough for everybody. And if it's tough for everybody, then the scoring scale is going to be easier to reflect that. Now, this is obviously true for all, for all four sections of the SAT, but I think in particular, it's a source of comfort in the reading section. Because yes, there can be a few math questions that are unfamiliar, or a lot of them, but if there's a lot of unfamiliar math questions on the SAT, then there were probably a lot of unfamiliar math questions to the student in their practice. In the writing language, sure, you can have some questions that are tricky, but in the SAT reading section, you can have an entire passage that is tricky. And if the entire passage is tricky, that can cost the student 2, 3, sometimes 4 questions. But again, if it's tough for you on test day, there's a good chance it's going to be tough for everybody else. And they're going to have a more forgiving scoring scale to reflect that. So just do not freak out. Do not stress out if you get a tough passage, and just keep on doing your best. All right. The clock strategy that I tell students, before I keep going, actually, make sure to read the brief italicized introduction. It's, a lot of students pass over this. It's very important to always read it. There's good information in there. You might recognize the author's name or the speaker's name, Abraham Lincoln, etc. They're always going to have the date in there. So it's really important to know what date the article was published or the speech was given. And here's what it looks like. That one's not very long. It's usually a little bit longer than this, but sure, here's the name, Ian King. The name of the book, Can Economics Be Ethical? And then when it was published in 2013. Just to give you another one. Let me find it. Here it is. Again, this one's still pretty short. Virginia Woolf, recognizable name, 1938, so just over 80 years ago. And here it also says she considers the situation of women in society. So that's going to give a student a big hint, because as you can see here, there's a lot of long words. There's a lot of unfamiliar words. So just having that 6 words right here of saying the situation of women in English society, not 7 words, that's going to help the student really be aware of what's coming. One more introduction. As you can see, a lot of introductions will be a little bit on the longer side. But again, the all-important year, the publication, the authors, X-ray crystallography diagrams. I don't know what those are, but hey, that might be helpful for some people. Okay, so always read the introduction. Okay. In general, the clock strategy that I give to students for the SAT or the ACT is generally to check the clock when you're about halfway through the section. So when you're halfway through the section, check the clock, has approximately half the time elapsed, etc. Well, this is not optimal strategy during the SAT reading section because there are 5 passages. So it doesn't make sense to check the clock when you're halfway through the 3rd passage, because that's a little bit unclear. So what I do instead is I encourage students to check at the 40% mark. So when they have finished 2 out of the 5 passages. And so given that they should take 13 minutes per passage, there should be about 25 minutes should have elapsed by the time they finish the 2nd passage, the last question on the 2nd passage. I also encourage them to look at the clock after the 4th passage. So with 1 passage remaining, there should be at least 13 minutes, usually more, like 15 to 16 minutes remaining for them. And so here they check at the 40% mark after 2 passages and the 80% mark after 4 passages. Every other section on the SAT, especially, you can just check the clock at the halfway mark if that works for you. So that is a general overview. Again, the reading section is always going to be first. There's always going to be a short break after the reading section. So it's also the longest section. So just, practicing being ready for all of the different passages and all of the sheer volume of material and new information that a student is going to have to interpret. So now what I want to do is I want to go into the actual question types. Okay, so as you can see here, I've broken them down into 6 different question types. And the first question type that I want to go over is I want to go over words in context. Okay, so a words in context question is going to look like this. It's going to say, for example, as used in line 2, the word form most nearly means. Okay, so I'm starting with these because these are generally kind of the quickest. A lot of times they're the easiest. Just because they're usually easy doesn't mean that they're always easy, or that you should kind of not be respectful of the fact that they could be tricky. But in general, you do kind of want to beat the clock, meaning you want to get to a right answer. You want to be confident about it. And you want to do that in a relatively short period of time so that you can use some of that extra time, those extra few precious seconds that you gain against the clock in words and context questions by tackling other questions. So the first step is obviously to just flip back to the passage. Some question types, it's appropriate to kind of look at the answers first and then refer back to the passage. But in this case, you really want to go back to the passage first. Maybe a glance at the answers isn't terrible. But in general, I do encourage students to go back and actually read the passage, read that, that specific sentence. And so I want to give you an actual example from a passage here. Okay, so here it says, this is a classic words in context question. As used in line 58, clashes most nearly means. Okay. So here's the sentence. Many moral dilemmas arise when these three versions pull in different directions, but clashes are not inevitable. The next thing that you want to do is you want to come up with your own synonym. So without looking at the answers, it's ideal to look at it and to say, okay, what word that I know the meaning of can I put here instead, and will the sentence make sense? So I would put, say, disagreements, right? Many moral dilemmas arise when these three versions pull in different directions, but disagreements are not inevitable. Okay. So then with that synonym in mind, you go back to the question and you say, well, is a disagreement, could it be considered a conflict? Sure. Could it be considered a mismatch? Not really. Could it be considered a collision? Not really. Could it be considered a brawl? Not really. And so that helps us realize that A is indeed the answer. If it comes down to two answers, what you can do is you can take, let's say we weren't sure, let's say it was between collisions and conflicts, so A and C, but we knew it wasn't mismatches or brawls. What we could do is we could then go back to the sentence and plug those two answers in and see how they go. And sure enough, when you say many moral dilemmas arise when these three versions pull in different directions, but conflicts are not inevitable, that just works really well, right? That has a great true ring to it. So that is how to tackle words in context questions. The other thing that you want to be wary of is a lot of students will just say, well, clashes, brawls, means clashes, right? If you have two armies clash, you have two armies brawl. So a lot of students will just only look at the meaning of the word clashes without taking into context, without taking into account the context of that word in the sentence. And the SAT's, the SAT is going to do that on purpose, where it's going to give you answers that would be fine synonyms for the quoted word in some other scenarios, but just not in this one. For example, back to that lack example and want example, I did have a words in context question. There is a words in context question on a historical SAT where they asked by want the author most nearly means, and one of the answers was desire, and desire was the wrong answer, and lack was the right answer. So that is a specific instance of the SAT using the fact that a story or an article was published 300 years ago, and trying to take advantage of the fact that students are going to probably pick, or oftentimes pick, desire over lack to mean want. So that is a words in context question. Before we go any further, I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to Um, when it comes to the just general strategy. So easily, one of the, I would say probably the most common mistake that I see on the entire reading comprehension section and on the writing language as well is that students try to look for the right answer. It's just, right? They're just used to it. That's how they've always done it, perhaps. They will read a question and then they will go through each answer by answer, and they will ask themselves, is this the right answer? Well, asking yourself the question, is this the right answer? That's a tougher question to figure out than the question, is this the wrong answer? Because if you ask yourself, is this the wrong answer? You're either going to get, yes, this is a wrong answer, in which case you cross it out. No, it's definitely not the wrong answer, in which case you don't cross it out. And I don't know if this is the wrong answer. And I would say the second most common mistake is that when students think to themselves, I don't know if this is the wrong answer or not, they stay there. They stay focused on this answer choice. So for example, to go back to the, right? So let's say the student is not sure if collisions is the wrong answer or not, right? They know that conflicts are like they really are, they feel confident that conflicts is not is not a wrong answer, at least not right away. Mismatches, they're confident is a wrong answer. And then they look at collisions and they say, okay, I don't know if collisions is a wrong answer. Well, a lot of students will freeze and they will say, well, I need to figure out if collisions is the wrong answer or not. And the answer to that is if it's the first pass through the questions, you really want to go through the reading answers at least twice. On the first pass, all you're doing is trying to get the obviously wrong answers out of the way and physically crossed off, not mentally crossed off, physically crossed off. If you're a mentor, all of your students should have crossed off answers for every question. If you're a student, all of your reading questions should have crossed off answers for every single question. Maybe there are a handful of questions that are just so easy that you can go right to the right answer, but that's going to be very rare. That's going to be 1 out of 10, maybe. So physically crossing off the wrong answer is that a profound habit? No, because it's just you just take your pencil and you draw a line through it. But so many students do not do this, and this is a massive mistake. So if you're not sure, if you're going through your first pass and you say, I don't know if collisions is wrong or not, again, you're not asking yourself, is it right? You're asking yourself, is it wrong? Well, you treat I don't know if it's wrong exactly the same as you treat no, it's probably not wrong, right? So we're going to treat which is you don't cross it out and you move on to the next, to the next answer. Okay, so students historically spend way too much time hovering over answers the first time that they are seeing them, asking themselves if that answer is wrong or not, in which case just move on. You really shouldn't be spending more than like 10 or 15 seconds looking for the obviously wrong answers. Okay, so I'm going to be referring back to that important strategy throughout our session today. Okay. The next question type is the main idea question type, okay? These are often considered the toughest, the most tedious, the trickiest. Main idea questions are great to come back to. It's really great to come back to a reading, obviously do your best, but don't spend much more than a minute, or so doing it, if that. And if it's going to take longer than that, then just kind of mark on your bubble sheet to come back to that question with like a little dash mark, and then come back to it after you've finished the passage, or after you finish the entire section. Usually it's kind of better to come back to a question after the passage is over to see if answering the other questions really helped you get some more information. But main idea questions are often kind of the first question that you're asked. maybe the second question. Sometimes it'll say, what is the main idea? Sometimes it'll say main purpose, central theme, right? And students often struggle with these because they tend to heavily rely on how closely did you read the passage. You know, you've only got 4 to 5 minutes, 4 to 6 minutes to read a passage. Did you read it closely enough to be able to answer this question? But luckily, there's also another trick. And this trick is to reread the first paragraph, right? To reread the first paragraph, because for a lot of SAT reading passages, the first paragraph will include the main idea in it, because that's just simply good writing style, right? If there's an idea, if there's an answer choice whose idea is not mentioned in the first paragraph, there's a good chance that answer's wrong. Because if it was a central enough theme, then it would be mentioned in the first paragraph. In some cases, the last paragraph will be a better source of central themes. I would say it's more often the first paragraph than the last paragraph. The last paragraph also, oftentimes just kind of, if there's an experiment involved in the passage, a lot of times the last paragraph will just summarize the results of the experiment. And that's not going to give you necessarily the overarching big theme. So the first paragraph would do a better job. Notice for the fiction passage, it's usually not going to be either one, right? A lot of times in the fiction passage, the author will just jump right into whatever the story is. Most of the time, the fiction passage begins in the middle of a story. It doesn't begin on page 1, like, it was the worst of times, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It doesn't usually begin with the first sentence. It begins in the middle of the story. So this technique is not great for the first passage, which is the literary passage, but it is great for the sciences and the histories. Another big important theme here is, if the first paragraph is 6 lines or less, then you can reread every word and know that that's time well spent. But if the first paragraph is like 12 lines or more, then reading every word in order to answer one main idea question is not going to be optimal. So you want to skim it. And if it's 7 to 11 lines, use your best judgment, right? If it's closer to 7 lines, if it's like 7 or 8 lines, and the student knows that you're doing well on time, then maybe you can read every word. If it's closer to kind of 10, 11 lines, and you're behind on time, then lean towards skimming it. And interestingly, this is a great rule of thumb for the entire SAT reading section. So not just main idea questions. If any question has a line reference with 12 lines or more, you're gonna wanna skim it. If it has 6, maybe 7 lines or less, then it's correct every time to read every word. And if it's in between, use your judgment. That's my own personal rule, but it really does seem to be consistently correct. In general, before you go back to the passage on a main idea question, you want to get the obviously wrong answers out of the way first. So in the words and context questions, I recommended going back to the passage first before really taking a close look at the answers to come up with a synonym. For the main idea questions, I do think with a relatively reasonably focused initial reading of the passage can get at least 1 or 2 wrong answers out of the way. And here's what a main idea question might look like. 1 second. So question number 11, right? The main purpose. So notice it doesn't say main idea outright, but it does say main purpose. And then just notice how general these answers are, right? That can be tricky, right? The fact that they're not pointing to specific details that can be, figured out to be or deemed inaccurate or accurate, right? These are just sort of general overarching themes. But again, if you read the passage closely, if you reread that first paragraph and or the last paragraph, you should be able to get these answers out of the way. The wrong answers out of the way and find the right answer. The other thing to notice with these questions is that there's kind of 2 to 3 parts to each answer here, right? There's the verb, consider, describe, argue, examine. And in this case, those 4 verbs are pretty similar. But in a lot of cases, the verbs that an answer choice starts with, especially to like a main idea, can be quite different, right? They can be inquire or compare, right? And the right answer is gonna be accurate across all parts of the answer. So if a question isn't comparing 2 viewpoints or comparing, and it's more describing or arguing, then you can get rid of the question that says compare because that's just not an accurate verb to describe what the author was doing. In this case, there are 3 parts. So here there's an ethical dilemma, a psychological study, argue that the free market, or evaluating the ethics, right? So that is another aspect of the answer choices that you can compare. If there's no ethical dilemma in the passage, then you can get rid of it, that answer choice. If there's no psychological study or psychology study, then you can get rid of that answer. So feel free to break answers down into miniature parts and assess the accuracy of each part of the answer. And then lastly is the last part, which is analysis, economic behavior, ethical economics, the ethics of economics, right? So if they are not looking at a cost-benefit analysis, then that is another potential way to cross off the wrong answers. So that kind of breaks down how to tackle a main idea question. I just wanted to come back to the importance of crossing off wrong answers for one more reason, which is on average, there are approximately 2 answers per question that are just far off. They're just very far off. Now you have over 50 questions in the reading section. So if you have on average 2 pretty clearly wrong answers, that means that you're going to have 100 clearly incorrect answer choices on the entire SAT reading section. Another very common mistake that I see students make is they kind of root for all the answers, or they kind of give answers the benefit of the doubt. Like if an answer sounds intelligent, but mentions something that the author didn't ever talk about, and the student maybe was a little bit distracted while reading the passage, they might think, well, I don't know, maybe the author did talk about that in the passage, which again points back to the importance of being focused, practicing reading, improving your reading comprehension skills, but also just knowing that there are going to be close to approximately 100 clearly incorrect answer choices in the SAT reading passage means that if you kind of hem and haw before crossing off every single answer that's not the right answer, you're going to be wasting a lot of time. So especially with practice, students will become more confident and kind of quicker to realize like, hey, this answer is just nowhere near. It's not even in the same ballpark as the answer, as the correct answer. So obviously, there's also the other end of the spectrum, which is if you're too quick to cross off an answer, then you are going to cross off a wrong, or cross off the right answer maybe, which is going to make your life even more difficult. So try to find that happy medium of it's either yes, I know this is the wrong answer, or no, or I don't know if it's the wrong answer or not. And if it's no, it's not the wrong answer, or I don't know if it's the wrong answer, then just don't cross it off. So only cross off answers that you are confident are incorrect. Okay. This brings us to the third kind of question type. This is kind of my own personal label for it, which is kind of questions with line references in them. Okay, so here's an example. Woolf characterizes the questions in lines 53 through 57. Okay, now do not confuse this line reference question with this line reference question, right? You're going to see these line references where every single answer choice has a line reference in it. That is not, that's a different type of question called a command of evidence pair. That's not what I'm referring to right now. The kind of question that I'm referring to has one line reference in the body of the question, not in the answers. Okay. It's usually a short reference, like the 5 lines that you see here. The important thing to remember here is that the answer to a question with a line reference in it will almost never be in the lines that it references. That would be way too easy. Like this test is for 17 and 18-year-olds, right? Maybe some 16-year-olds. But on average, the student, the test takers are 17 years old, which means that it would be much too easy to say, hey, go look in these 5 lines and then find the right answer and then come back and cross off the 3 wrong answers and then find the right one. That's just, that's more of like a middle school level reading comprehension question, maybe like a freshman in high school, but it's not a sophomore, junior, or senior year comprehension, in terms of difficulty. So what does the College Board do? They put the answer to the question shortly before or shortly after the line reference, okay? And I'm going to actually show it to you with that exact example. Okay. So here's the question. You don't even need to have read the passage yet. Woolf characterizes the questions in lines 53 through 57. Now, interestingly, in this case, 53 through 57, you don't even actually have to know what the questions are. In general, if there's a line reference, go and read it. I'm just saying for this specific case, what is much more important is the sentence before and the sentence after, okay? So the questions are what they are. We don't really care what they are in this example. But let's look at the sentence before. The questions that we have to ask and to answer about that procession during this moment of transition are so important that they may well change the lives of all men and women forever. So if you were going to, and if you can remember, the questions all had, or the answers all had adjectives, 2 adjectives in them, right? So if you were going to come up with one adjective, it would probably be important. That's what this sentence is telling you, that these questions are important. And then you look at the sentence after. The moment is short. It may last 5 years, 10 years, or perhaps only a matter of a few months longer. Okay, so this is giving you another potential adjective. What adjective would you say this is giving you? I would say urgent. So these questions appear to be important and they appear to be urgent. So then you go back and you say, well, is controversial and threatening right? No, that's not right. Is weighty and unanswerable right? Well, weighty is right. I don't know about unanswerable, but weighty, like weighty meaning having weight. So letter B is a question where you may not want to cross it off because it may be kind of too early to tell whether or not B is wrong. Momentous and pressing, well, momentous and pressing looks great, right? Momentous means of huge importance, pressing means urgent, so we really like it. So now we can actually get rid of B because we like C more than B. So see how it may not be correct to cross off B right away because it has a word that is kind of spot on in weighty, like weighty, but once you see answer C, you see that B is no longer really a possibility. Provocative and mysterious, maybe provocative, right? Maybe thought-provoking, but not mysterious. Okay, so that helps us get to the answer C. And notice how if we didn't read the sentence before or the sentence after, then we wouldn't be able to answer that question there. Full disclosure, this is actually the first question in a command of evidence pair. So we really wouldn't want to, we would actually want to employ a different strategy, knowing that this is the first question in a command of evidence pair. But I did want to treat this example as kind of a standalone example because I thought it was really kind of telling. Also, turns out the right answer to letter C is, or to 39 is answer choice C, which is the only answer choice that has a line reference that is right after that initial line reference, which is kind of interesting. So, but that is how you answer the questions that have line references in them. Okay. So yeah, the SAT often hides key clues just before or after line references mentioned in the wording of a question. Now, I have seen plenty of exceptions to this rule, which is, for example, there are cases where the line reference will be like 15 lines, like, from lines 30 to 44. The author is trying to blah, blah, blah. Well, if the answer choice, if the line reference rather is going to be that long, then the answer is probably going to be hidden in there somewhere, right? Now, again, coming back to considering the age and the proficiency and the level of development of the average 17-year-old, yeah, should a 17-year-old be able to read 15 lines and then read the sentence before and then the sentence after and then cross off 3 wrong answers in a minute or less? Probably not. So if the line reference is really long, there's a decent chance that the answer will actually be in there. But most line references for line reference questions are going to be very short. They're going to be 2 lines, 3 lines, 6 lines, in which case it becomes correct to look outside of them to find the right answer. Okay, so the fourth question type is what I call questions without line references. Okay, so a lot of questions do not contain any line references at all, right? And yet they will ask very detailed, they'll ask for very detailed information, which kind of begs the question, like, how is a student supposed to read a passage in 5 minutes or less, or try to, and then remember what they said very specifically in this very particular part of a question, right? And the answer to that is that they're not expected to. They're expected to remember where they talked about that in the passage and then maybe go back to that. So that's one way that you can answer this question. Another way that I really like, that I'll teach you through example, is one second here, is that questions that don't have line references will oftentimes have proper nouns in the question. So here it says, the interaction between Miss Spivey and Ralford serves mainly to, okay? And from reading this passage, you will figure out that Miss Spivey is the main character, right? Ralford is a secondary character. Proper nouns are great to, they're very good resources to go back and look and scan the passage for them, because these capital letters, as sort of detailed as this next point sounds, it's actually very important, which is these little capital letters actually kind of stick out like sore thumbs in the passage, right? If these words weren't capitalized, they'd be a little bit trickier to find them. So you go back, so it's not good to go back and look for the main character's name, because her name's going to be all over the place. It makes much more sense to go back and look for the secondary character's name, the minor character's name. And so a great and fun and actually important exercise is to scan this passage for Ralford's name and to figure out how many places Ralford's name is mentioned and where. So just play the game and take 15 seconds and scan the passage and find that capital R, Ralford, and see where you can find the word Ralford. Again, this is a very important skill to hone and to work on. Okay, time is approximately up. Sure enough, line 33, my little brother Ralford. And then down here on line 55, Miss Spivey paused there for questions, avoiding my brother Ralford's eye. We have a few more here and a quick scan. Again, you can kind of move your eyes down the center and use your peripheral vision to see that there's no Ralford there. And so it's only mentioned in 2 places, and sure enough, the answer to that question is tucked into one of those references to Ralford. So that is a very important skill to utilize. Combine that with your knowledge of like, oh yeah, they didn't really talk about Ralford in the beginning. They didn't really talk about Ralford at the very end. I know it was kind of somewhere in the middle. Wasn't really on the left. Oh yeah, it was kind of up here on the right and down there on the right. So that's exactly the kind of analysis that students want to be utilizing. Just to give you another example here, we have this looks like a main purpose or main idea question, but then it says of including the information about X-ray evidence and density. So it's not actually saying what is the main purpose of the whole passage. It's actually saying what is the purpose of using, and I'm mentioning those. Well, does it make sense to look for density? I mean, maybe, but probably not. Density doesn't really stick out very well. Does X-ray stick out? Yes. X-ray is very easy to find. And yeah, they say it here, but again, that's the kind of crystallography mention. And sure enough, you can see how much X-ray sticks out on line 18. However, the density taken with the X-ray evidence suggests very strongly that there are two what? 2 chains coiled around a common fiber axis. Okay. It has often been assumed there was only 1 chain, and sure enough, the answer here is that it provides support to the author's claim about the number of chains in a molecule of DNA. So that is how you tackle questions that do not have line references in them. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to go to graph questions. Okay. Students usually kind of groan inwardly when they see graph questions because they think, oh, I have to go and like analyze this graph and it's going to take all this time. And honestly, it actually really only takes like 30 seconds or less to really properly analyze a graph. And then once you do that, graph questions are very frequently like the most, like probably the easiest question, even easier than words and context questions. Words and context questions are faster, but graph questions you can answer with greater certainty. There are a few tricky graph questions, but most graph questions are just like one of my students kind of famously asked me like, wait, so this question is just asking me like, can I look at this graph and tell you what it says very obviously? And I said, yes, that's exactly what it's testing you on. So hopefully I have motivated my students to kind of get encouraged when they see a graph question. Graph questions are always asked at the end of a passage, right? They're never kind of one of the first few questions. They're always kind of one of the last questions to be asked. And I'm going to portray, also we want to, you want to be methodical about looking at a graph, okay? Students are, when you're taking a test, you're generally in this frame of mind where you're moving quickly, you're kind of rushing a little bit because unfortunately tests kind of train students to rush when you really shouldn't rush when you're doing kind of research papers and stuff like that for school or math problem sets. You really shouldn't rush whenever you're working. So I don't like that aspect of standardized tests, just to give you my 2 cents. But slightly rushing or really, trying to work in a sort of faster way than you would normally want to do your homework is necessary in general on standardized tests. But when you get to graph questions, you do kind of want to slow down a little bit because you do have to kind of break it apart and look at it in terms of title of the graph, et cetera, et cetera. So first we look at the title of the graph, regular coffee profits compared to fair trade coffee profits in Tanzania, okay? Then you look at the units of the x-axis. So this is year, ranging from 2000 to 2008. And then you kind of want to tilt your head to the side or turn your paper, obviously, to read that it says amount, US cents per pound, from 0 to 160 cents. Notice we still haven't even looked at the content of the graph yet. We've started by looking at the title, then the labels for each axis. We're still not there yet because now we're going to look at the legend or the key. The open dot is fair trade, the solid dot is regular, and then only now, after you've taken, again, kind of a full 20 seconds or so, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is kind of okay, I gotta be methodical, take my time. Only then do you then look at the graph itself and just what is the obvious piece of information. Well, fair trade coffee, ironically, has more profits than regular. Why is that ironic? Well, because fair trade involves treating workers ethically, paying them what they deserve to be paid. So you would think that people that farmers or managers that don't pay their their workers necessarily fairly would make more money. But this graph is showing you that the opposite is true. And sure enough, if you go down to the graph, that's all you needed to see. Fair trade coffee consistently earned profits, greater profits than regular coffee. Okay, look at how easy that question is. Showing that this exact question to my students always gives them more confidence. They're like, okay, graph questions are just really not that hard. Sure, that's kind of maybe an easier example, but a lot of them are just not going to be that much harder than that question right there. Again, this is not profound, just like crossing off wrong answers. It's not a profound concept to look at the title, then the labels, then the key, but how many students actually do it versus how many students just let their mind kind of dart around aimlessly, right? So just be methodical. And then the last question type that we have here is probably one of the most important because it has two questions in it. It's a pair, and it's called the command of evidence pair, okay? These questions are always back to back. This is the reason why you always need to track what is the question that comes after the question that I'm on. For every single question on the SAT, you want to kind of use your peripheral, I'm like on the reading section, you want to use your peripheral vision to see, is the next question after this one, does it look like this? Does it look like this? Is the second question one where every single answer is a line reference? Because if it is, I'm going to show you, you really shouldn't spend very much time on the first question, okay? Because you're going to be reading all of these line references, all of them. But if it's not, if you had this question right here, and it wasn't part of a command of evidence pair, there wasn't this follow-up question, well, then you would treat this like a question without a line reference. Okay, Akira and Chi. Well, one of, those are my two proper nouns. I'm going to go back to the passage and scan the passage for Akira and Chi. Akira is, the main character. Chi is maybe a secondary, so I look for Chi instead of Akira and figure out what reaction Akira has, or what she most fears, from Chi. So, also, I have seen the SAT be very, very mean in the fact that the last question on one page will be the first question in a command of evidence pair. And then the next question on the next page will be this sort of line reference question. That's mean, right? Because, even when I was taking that practice test myself for the first time, I treated the first question in the pair like it was just a regular question. So I referred back to the passage. I kind of spent all this time looking at it and analyzing it and kind of realizing, oh, this is a really tough question. And then sure enough, I flipped the page and there I realized I just made a big mistake because I didn't treat this like it was a command of evidence pair. Okay, so do make sure that you are checking, like, does the next question make me realize that these two questions are a command of evidence pair? Okay, so then how do we actually tackle these? Well, what we do is all you do is you cross off the obviously wrong answers for the first question. Okay, we're not going to actually tackle this one, of course, but let's say that there are two clearly wrong answers, right? Um, let's say, the clearly wrong answers are letter B and then letter D, right? So B and D are the clearly wrong answers, okay? What we would usually do is we would try to, maybe refer back to the passage, try to figure out, is it A or is it C? You are not going to do that because you're going to be referring back to the passage in the second question. So you take 10 or 15 seconds, you get B and D out of the way, you physically cross them off, and then you move on to the second question. The second question, it is always right. I want to say 100% of the time, or 99.9% of the time, to read every word of every line reference. Okay? It's really important that you as students and you as mentors give your students the permission, the mental permission, to be confident in knowing that referring back to the passage 4 times for one question is appropriate. How is a student going to have the time to do that? Well, the first question in the pair was moved through very quickly. Obviously, you didn't get a right answer. You got it down to 2, but you moved through the first question in the pair very quickly. So you're going to take that extra time and apply it towards reading every word of all 4 line references in the second question. The second thing is that you're going to also gain some time against the clock in like your words and context questions, right? That are consistently taking students far less time than the average reading question type. So those are kind of the 2 main reasons why you're going to have more time to tackle these questions that have 4 different line references in them. Another reason why you're going to actually be able to get through the second question here is that, again, at least 2 of these line references are going to be way off the mark. Maybe in some cases only 1, but it's usually 2 or 3. 2 line references are just going to be terrible, terrible answers. Just really, really poor answers that don't make any sense, that are not good in any way, shape, or form. In fact, let me see if I can actually pull up how hilariously bad. Look at how bad this first answer is. His voice, ... refined. Okay, so 33. So we're going to actually go back. His voice was soft and refined. Okay. How does this in any way tell us what reaction Akira most fears from Chi? It doesn't. Okay, so that is a classic case of just how far out in left field this answer is. And there's probably going to be at least one other line reference that is just comically bad, very, very bad. So I used to personally hate the second question in a command of evidence pair, and now it's consistently kind of my favorite reading question type because they tell you right where to look, right? They tell you exactly where to look. One other little trick is that maybe as students, you want to memorize these 2 line references at the same time. So, okay, I'm going to go to 33, and then I'm going to go to 49 through 51. Some students can maybe try to memorize 3 or 4, but every time I try to do that, I kind of end up getting confused. So I generally try to memorize, okay, I got to look at 33 and then look at 49 through 51. Okay, and then you can kind of go back to the passage once for the top 2 answer choices, and then a second time for the 3rd and 4th answer choice. I have seen students, very frequently or commonly read too far. So in some cases, the line reference will not end at the end of a sentence. So it won't be obvious where the line reference ends. So make sure you use, where it tells you to start and where it tells you to finish. But generally what happens is you'll cross off 2 to 3 obviously wrong answers for the first question. And then you'll cross off 2 to 3 wrong answers for the second question. Obviously, it's ideal when there's 3 bad answers for both. That's not necessarily incredibly common, but it does happen plenty of times. In most cases, or in a lot of cases, you'll kind of have 2 to 3 bad answers for one, 2 bad answers for the other, and then you can kind of mix and match and use that method to figure out. But you will probably be going kind of back and forth. there are some cases where, and plenty of times where, this question's easy enough to get the right answer the first time before you even move on. But just be willing to move on, not knowing what the right answer to this question is before you tackle the second question. Okay. So those are kind of all of the question types, the 6 major ones. There might be a question type or two that falls outside of those. So that list is not necessarily completely comprehensive, but it will cover the vast majority of SAT reading questions that you're going to cover. One other point that I want to make is that notice that doing one reading passage, which takes 13 minutes, is kind of an ideal amount of study time. You take 5 minutes to read the passage. You take 8 minutes to read the questions and answer the questions. You take a minute to check and see how many you got right, how many you got wrong. You take 5, maybe 10 minutes to figure out and rework the questions that you missed. And there you have like a nice 20-minute chunk or so of time to do an SAT reading question. I have had students that do the full sort of 60 to 90 minutes of homework that I give them the day before we have our session. And that's just not as good as taking 15 to 30 minutes every other day or so, and kind of chipping away at their ability to do well on the SAT and to do their homework. So the fact that a reading passage is 13 minutes plus extra for corrections, grading, reworking, really gives a student kind of a defined amount of work to do on a day when their next SAT tutoring session is 5 days away, but it kind of makes them easy to kind of build in that natural structure there. Okay. Let me see here. Just a few other odds and ends. There is one comparative passage. What do I mean by comparative passage? It's right, excuse me, I hope I'm not making you seasick. It's right here. So notice it says passage 1 and then passage 2. A lot of students will read both passages first and then answer the questions. That's a big, big mistake. What you want to do is read passage 1, answer the first 3 to 4 questions, because notice they are all about passage 1. In this case, the first 5 questions are about passage 1. Then you read passage 2, and then you answer passage 2 questions. Again, there will generally be kind of 3 to 4 there. And then the last few questions will be about both. Passage 2, passage 1, passage 2, passage 1. So here the last 4 questions were about both passages. So read passage 1, answer passage 1 questions, read passage 2, answer passage 2 questions, and then answer the questions that are about both. You also want to be really wary of questions that have extreme wording. So if they say never or always, entirely, completely, if they have extreme wording, I would be extremely wary and suspicious of answering them, because there's a good chance that they're wrong and that the right answer is kind of a more gray area, maybe, possibly, may, or might. That's oftentimes the wording or the appropriate wording there. But that brings us to a close. So just kind of top down to review what we did, which is read the passage as closely as possible in about 5 minutes. Take about 8 minutes to answer the questions. Look for wrong answers first. Take 2 passes through the questions. The first pass is to get the clearly terrible, awful, bad answers out of the way by physically crossing them out. The second pass is to ask yourself, okay, is this answer right or is this answer right? So you're comparing the answers to each other now. And then use these strategies, be able to categorize the question that you're on. Is it a words in context question? Is it a main idea? A question with a line reference, a question without a line reference, a graph question, or a command of evidence pair? And then memorize the technique that you're supposed to use for each one. So words in context is come up with your own synonym. 1 second, I have this list right here. Words in context is coming up with your own synonym. The main idea is to reread the first or last paragraph. The questions with line reference is to read the sentence before or read the sentence after the line reference. The questions without line reference is to scan the passage for the proper nouns. The graph question is just to properly interpret the graph. And then the command of evidence pair is to get all of the wrong answers for both questions out of the way first, and then to tackle it from there and to try to mix and match the answers with the line references. That is it. Thank you so much. I hope this really helped you out a lot. And feel free to email me at jneville@esmprep.com. That's JNEVILLE at esmprep.com. Thank you.